I'm so hungry. Could you please buy just one flower from us? The words trembled out of the child's mouth, thin and fragile as the breath that vanished into the winter air. The snow had begun falling earlier than usual that Christmas Eve, not in the kind of flurries that invited children to play, but in a cold, sharp curtain that drove the city indoors. The streets were almost deserted. The only lights came from the glowing windows of restaurants and the neon signs that flickered above empty sidewalks. For Alexander Hale, those lights reflected faintly on the hood of his black Bentley as he steered it through the silent avenue. Alexander was a man of staggering wealth. Every headline in the financial world had his name stamped across it. Tech titan, ruthless visionary, the man who bought tomorrow. That was the kind of myth people wrote about him. Yet tonight, as the Bentley purred toward the gates of his estate, none of those titles seemed to matter. He had returned from another sterile gala, his tie loosened, his face heavy with the familiar weight of silence. It was then, beneath a broken street lamp, that he saw them. Two girls stood close together, no more than 11 and 7, clutching tiny bundles of flowers wrapped in old newspaper. Their shoes were soaked, their coats torn thin, and still they tried to smile at anyone who passed. No one stopped. People hurried by with shopping bags and steaming coffee cups, muttering against the cold. Alexander would have driven on. That was what years of power had trained him to do. Keep moving. Never stop for the weak. Never let empathy break the rhythm. But when the younger one lifted her face and spoke, his hands froze on the steering wheel. I'm so hungry. Could you please buy just one flower from us? The voice was cracked, but not desperate. It wasn't begging. It was a child's attempt at dignity, as if the simple act of selling a flower could still shield her from pity. Alexander's chest tightened. He didn't know why. He had heard every plea in the book, from investors begging for another chance to men on their knees outside his office doors. But this fragile voice in the snow, undid him. He rolled down the window. What did you say? The girl clutched the flowers tighter, as if afraid he might take them away. Her sister, taller, older, with sharp eyes that flickered like guarded embers, stepped forward. She didn't speak right away. She just looked at him. And in that instant, Alexander felt the ground shift. Because the look in her eyes, dark, unwavering, almost accusing, was one he had known once in the mirror of his own childhood. The silence stretched. The wind whipped snow into their hair. Finally, the older girl said softly, We've been out here all day. Nobody wants to buy. If you could take just one, maybe my sister won't cry herself to sleep tonight. Alexander swallowed. He could have handed them $100 bill and driven off. That would have been the clean solution, the kind that solved the problem without entangling himself in it. But something in him resisted. His fingers trembled against the leather steering wheel. He leaned closer, his eyes fixed on theirs. The younger girl stepped forward, holding up a single carnation, petals slightly wilted but still clinging to their blush of pink. Her hands shook in the cold. For a moment, Alexander was no longer a billionaire in a Bentley. He was a boy again, barefoot in the slums of a steel town, clutching a paper bag of apples to sell on the street. He remembered the sting of winter in his lungs, the taste of shame in his mouth, the endless longing for someone, anyone, to stop and see him. And now, here were two pairs of eyes, staring at him with that same silent plea. He opened the door and stepped out. The snow crunched under his polished shoes. The girls stiffened, as though expecting to be chased away. Instead, Alexander crouched down until his gaze was level with theirs. He studied their faces, the older one's jawline, the younger one's eyes. Both carried an uncanny resemblance. His stomach twisted. "What are your names?" he asked. The older girl hesitated. "Clara," she said at last, her voice firm despite the trembling of her hands. She nudged the little one gently. The child lifted her chin. "Sophie. Clara. Sophie." The names pressed against Alexander's memory like ghosts knocking on a locked door. He couldn't say why, but they seemed familiar. "Where are your parents?" His tone came out sharper than he intended. Clara's eyes flickered with something unreadable. She clutched her sister's shoulder. "Mother is gone. Father doesn't know us." The words struck him like a whip. He tried to mask the tremor in his face, but Sophie's innocent gaze held him captive. He couldn't look away. Gone. Doesn't know us. Alexander's breath misted in the cold. He wanted to turn back to his car, to escape into the cocoon of leather and silence. But the older girl reached into a small cloth satchel hanging from her side. She pulled out a worn notebook, its cover frayed, its pages tied with a string. She held it out to him with both hands. "Mother said, if we ever found you, we should give this back." Alexander stared at it. His pulse pounded in his ears. "Found me," he echoed. Clara nodded, her expression unflinching. "She said you would understand." The notebook trembled between them, fragile as the moment itself. The wind howled, the snow thickened, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled midnight. Alexander did not take the notebook. Not yet. He couldn't. His throat had closed around the storm rising inside him. Instead, he looked at Clara, then Sophie. Their faces were pale, their fingers blue with cold, their eyes blazing with a truth he wasn't ready to admit. And still, the younger one whispered again, softer this time, almost a plea. "Please, just one flower. We're so hungry." Alexander reached for his wallet. But what he touched inside was not leather, not money, but the sudden weight of something he had buried long ago. Memory, love, regret. He shuddered, realizing that the night he thought would end in silence had only just begun. It wasn't just a notebook. It was a life he had abandoned, waiting to be read. The snow kept falling, the streets emptying into silence, but Alexander's world had become unbearably loud. The notebook trembled in his gloved hands as if it carried its own pulse, as if the pages inside were breathing. He had not wanted to take it, but Clara, with her eyes steady and her chin lifted, had pressed it against his chest as if she knew he would not refuse forever. Now he stood beneath the fractured street lamp, Bentley idling behind him, two children staring up at him with a mix of hope and fear. He told himself he was only curious. He told himself he would open it, find nothing but the ramblings of a desperate woman, and then he could drive away and forget. But even as he told himself that lie, he knew it would not hold. The string was rough, knotted tightly. His fingers shook as he untied it. The first page bore a name in handwriting he knew too well. Mary. The world tilted. He had not spoken that name aloud in decades. Mary. The girl who had once stood with him outside a shuttered factory, their breath fogging in the cold, her hands warm in his as she whispered of futures they would claim together. Mary, who had laughed at his dreams but believed them anyway. Mary, who had cried the night he left without a word. He turned the page. The ink was faded in places, smudged by time and, he suspected, by tears. The first entry was dated 12 years ago. He is gone. I don't know if I should hate him or still hope he will come back, but I carry him with me, in my hands, in my heart, and now, in the life growing inside me. Alexander's knees nearly buckled. His breath misted in shallow bursts. The words blurred as he read them, but he forced himself on. Page after page unfolded her loneliness, her struggles, her descent into sickness, and above all, her unyielding devotion to the two little girls who carried his blood. Clara has his eyes. Sophie has his smile. They will never know him, but perhaps one day he will see them and recognize himself. Alexander closed the book abruptly, as though the words could cut him if he let them. His jaw locked. He felt the sting of fury, but the fury was not at Mary. It was at himself. He had chosen ambition. He had chosen power, wealth, and the cold marble floors of boardrooms. And in choosing them, he had abandoned the only person who had seen him not as a titan, not as a future billionaire, but simply as a man. Where did you get this? His voice was harsher than he intended. Clara flinched, but she did not retreat. Mother gave it to me before she... Her voice broke. She swallowed hard, lifting her chin again. Before she left us. Sophie pressed closer to her sister's side, eyes wide with a fear too old for a child. She whispered, "She said you would remember." Alexander shut his eyes, just for a moment, but memory flooded in mercilessly. Mary's laugh, Mary's letters, unanswered. Mary standing at the edge of the station platform as he boarded the bus that would take him away from poverty and from her. He had buried it all under steel and glass, under stock charts and headlines. And now, in the trembling hands of two children selling wilted flowers, the past had returned like a ghost, demanding justice. His throat closed around the words. He could not say, "I'm sorry." He could not say, "I believe you." He had not yet earned either. Instead, he forced himself to meet Clara's gaze. "Do you have anywhere to go?" Her silence was an answer in itself. She looked down at Sophie, then back up at him with a mixture of pride and defiance. "We manage." Alexander's eyes flicked to their shoes, soles cracked, wet from slush, to their hands, reddened from cold, trembling though they tried to hide it. He felt an ache he had thought himself incapable of, not just pity, but recognition. He knew this kind of hunger, this kind of cold. He had lived it once, and he had sworn never to feel it again. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a crisp bill. He held it out, expecting relief to flash in their faces. Instead, Clara stared at it, then at him, and shook her head slowly. "We don't want your money," she said. Alexander stiffened. "What do you want, then?" Her voice was steady, even as her eyes glistened. "We just want you to see us." The words landed heavier than any accusation could have. He let his hand fall, the bill fluttering uselessly in the snow. He looked at Sophie, clutching the single carnation to her chest, her lips pale from cold but still trying to smile. He looked at Clara, standing as a shield in front of her sister, bearing too much weight for one so young. And in their eyes, unmistakably, he saw himself. For the first time in years, Alexander Hale had no clever response, no defense, no wall of logic or wealth to hide behind. He could only stand in the snow, a notebook of the past in his hand, two children of his future before him, and the echo of Mary's voice whispering through the pages. They will never know him, but perhaps one day he will see them. The Bentley engine purred impatiently behind him, a reminder of the life that waited, the sterile estate, the empty halls, the empire built on ambition. But here, in the half-light of a broken street lamp, another life waited, one he had fled, one he might still reclaim. Alexander closed the notebook gently, as though afraid to break it. He tucked it into his coat, not as a possession, but as a burden he could no longer cast aside. Then he looked at the girls. "Come with me," he said. The words tasted strange, unfamiliar. They were not a command, nor a plea. They were something else entirely, the first step toward a truth he had denied for far too long. Clara hesitated. Sophie's hand tightened around her sister's. The silence stretched between them, thick as the snow. Finally, Clara whispered, "Mother said if you ever came back, it would hurt before it healed." Her words cut deeper than the cold. Alexander had no answer. He simply lowered his gaze, humbled by the prophecy of a woman long gone and by the courage of two children who carried her light. The night was no longer silent. It had spoken, and it would not be silenced again. The Bentley's headlights cut across the snow like two unblinking eyes, casting long shadows of the girls onto the sidewalk. Clara and Sophie stood close, their breath visible in the frozen air, their bodies trembling but their gazes steady. In Alexander's hands, the notebook felt heavier than any contract he had ever signed, heavier than the billions he had built and the empire he commanded. It was not paper. It was proof. Every time he looked up from its worn cover, those two pairs of eyes met his, eyes he could not dismiss, could not explain away, eyes that carried a resemblance so sharp it was almost unbearable. Clara's brow furrowed in the same way his had when he was a boy trying to make sense of a world that never bent in his favor. Sophie's half-smile, fragile, defiant against despair, mirrored the smile Mary had once said made him look more human than he believed himself to be. Alexander drew a breath that cut against his throat like glass. "This doesn't mean what you think it means," he muttered, though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to them or to himself. Clara tilted her head, the faintest frown touching her face. "What does it mean, then?" Her question was not childish. It was precise, sharp, the kind of question that demanded an answer rather than comfort. He hated that he had no answer. Sophie tugged at Clara's sleeve. Her voice was softer, more tentative. "Maybe he just doesn't remember us." The words made Alexander flinch as if struck. Not remember? The truth was worse. He had chosen not to. He had built walls of steel and glass, buried his past under money and headlines, convinced himself that leaving Mary behind was an act of necessity rather than cowardice. But memory was not gone. It had been waiting for him, and now it looked up at him with two pairs of eyes that carried his own reflection. He crouched again, the snow seeping cold into the fine wool of his coat. "Where do you sleep?" he asked quietly. Clara's chin lifted. "We find places, shelters. Sometimes we stay near the church." Her tone was matter-of-fact, the kind of tone a child should never have to master. Sophie leaned forward eagerly, as though trying to soften the sharpness of her sister's words. "We're not trouble. We just sell flowers. Mama said it was better to sell something beautiful, even if nobody buys, than to beg." Her small hand uncurled, revealing the single carnation she had tried to sell him earlier. The petals were beginning to brown at the edges. Still, she held it out to him like an offering, like a bridge. Alexander stared at it. He felt the cold bite of guilt deeper than the snow. "How long have you been out here?" "Long enough," Clara replied. Her gaze burned. "Long enough to know no one sees us. Until now." The words landed like a verdict. For a moment, Alexander imagined walking back to the Bentley, shutting the door, sealing himself again in the cocoon of wealth and silence. He could drive away, write a check to some charity in their name, and never see them again. It was the path he knew, the path of clean transactions and easy erasures. But he could not. Not with the notebook against his chest. Not with those faces in the snow. He heard Mary's voice again, rising from the pages. Clara has his eyes. Sophie has his smile. He thought of Mary writing those words by lamplight, coughing between sentences, still believing that someday he might remember. The weight of what he had done, and what he had left undone, pressed on him until he almost gasped. "I should take you somewhere warm," he said at last, his voice hoarse. Clara's arms tightened protectively around Sophie. Why? The question startled him. He had expected relief, gratitude, anything but suspicion. But then he saw it. The shadow of betrayal etched too early into her face. She did not trust easily. She had been taught by absence, by disappointment, by nights waiting for someone who never came. Because, he faltered. The truth was raw, dangerous, and unpolished, but it was the only truth left. Because I can't leave you here. Clara studied him for a long time. The seconds stretched like years. Finally, she turned to Sophie, whispering something he could not hear. The little one nodded, clutching the carnation tighter. When Clara looked back at him, her eyes shone with something fierce and fragile. Then prove it. Alexander swallowed hard. The girl was 11, yet she spoke like a judge delivering a sentence. And perhaps she was. The Bentley behind him hummed impatiently, its warmth waiting. But the real weight, the real fire, was here in the snow. Two daughters who had never asked for a billionaire, who had never needed a kingdom, but who were asking, in their own unshaken way, for a father. He realized with a kind of terror that this was only the beginning. The Bentley's heater whispered warm air as the city lights blurred behind frosted windows. Clara and Sophie sat huddled together in the back seat, their tiny frames lost in the vast leather interior. Alexander gripped the wheel, but his eyes were not on the road. They were on the notebook lying open in the passenger seat, its pages fluttering faintly as if resisting the silence. He had driven them away from the snow, away from the fractured street lamp, into the quiet shelter of his mansion's gates. Yet the real storm had followed him inside the car, the storm of memory, of Mary's words that would not release him. Clara's voice broke the silence first. "Are you going to read it?" Alexander's jaw tightened. He glanced at the rearview mirror. Clara's eyes were steady, defiant even now. Sophie leaned against her sister's shoulder, half asleep but still clutching the carnation as if it were a lifeline. "Yes," he said at last, his voice low. "I'm going to read it." When they reached the estate, the vast iron gates swung open at his command. The house loomed ahead, glass and steel rising like a fortress against the night. Alexander had always thought of it as power incarnate. Tonight it felt empty, a hollow monument. Inside, the children hesitated in the foyer. Their breath fogged in the sudden warmth, their shoes dripping melted snow onto marble floors. Sophie's wide eyes darted from the chandelier to the sweeping staircase, but Clara held her hand tight, as if reminding her sister that glitter did not mean safety. Alexander led them into the library. The fire had long gone cold, but he lit it now, not for himself, but because the girls were shivering. They settled near the hearth, Sophie curling into Clara's lap. For the first time, he saw them without the blur of snow and hunger. Two children, fragile yet unbroken, carrying more resilience than he could ever claim. He sat opposite them, the notebook in his lap. His hands trembled as he opened it again. Entry, August 12th. Clara asked today why she doesn't have a father like the other children. I told her she does. She just hasn't met him yet. She asked if he was coming. I said yes, because I couldn't bear to tell her the truth. Alexander's throat closed. He turned the page. Entry, September 3rd. Sophie is smaller, weaker. The doctors say she needs better food, better medicine. I can't afford either. I wonder if he ever thinks of us in his world of steel and glass. Perhaps he doesn't even remember my name. But Sophie's smile is his. She smiles even when she's hungry. She smiles even when I cry. He shut the book abruptly, his hand covering his face. The silence pressed down on him until Clara spoke. "Why did you leave her?" The question sliced through him. He lowered his hand slowly, meeting her gaze. He could have lied. He could have crafted some story about fate or necessity. But Clara's eyes demanded truth, and Sophie's small body curled against her sister's warmth deserved nothing less. "Because I was a coward," he whispered. The words tasted like rust. "I told myself I had to chase success. I told myself love was a distraction. But the truth is, I was afraid of being poor forever. I thought if I left her, I could leave that life behind. I was wrong." Clara's face did not soften. If anything, her expression grew harder, as if testing the weight of his confession. "You left us too." The accusation burned deeper than fire. He could not deny it. "Yes," he said, "I left you. Even if I didn't know it, I left you the moment I walked away from her." Sophie stirred, her voice groggy with sleep. "Mama said you had sad eyes." Alexander's heart clenched. He looked at her, her small face pale, her eyelids heavy, and felt something break open inside him. He had spent a lifetime convincing himself that power could bury pain. But now, in the fragile innocence of a child's sleepy words, the truth surfaced. He had been building empires on broken ground. He opened the notebook again, forcing himself to read more. Entry, December 24th. It is Christmas Eve. The girls are asleep. I told them stories of their father, stories I made up because the truth is too cruel. I told Clara he was brave. I told Sophie he was kind. I told them he would come. And when I whispered those lies, I almost believed them myself. Alexander could no longer see the words. His eyes blurred, his chest heaved. He shut the notebook with shaking hands. "I don't deserve you," he said hoarsely, staring at the two children. "But I can't walk away again." Clara's gaze flickered, not yet trust, not yet forgiveness, but something softer, a hesitation, a space where belief might grow. Sophie yawned and nestled deeper into her sister's arms, still holding her flower. The fire crackled, the silence thickened, and for the first time in years, Alexander Hale, billionaire, empire builder, man of unshakable power, bowed his head and let himself weep. The legacy he had tried to shape in steel and glass was flawed, poisoned at its root. But perhaps with these two fragile lives before him, there was still a chance to rebuild. Not as a titan, not as a name in headlines, as a father. The morning light entered Alexander Hale's mansion like a trespasser. It slipped through the tall windows of the library, casting gold onto shelves lined with first editions and leather-bound volumes he had never opened. For years, sunlight here had fallen only on marble and silence. Today, it fell on something new. Two children curled together on the couch, still clutching the remnants of wilted flowers. Clara stirred first. Her eyes blinked against the brightness, sharp and wary even as sleep lingered. Sophie nestled against her shoulder, murmuring softly, refusing to release her grip on the single carnation. Alexander had not slept. He sat across the room, still in last night's suit, the notebook of Mary's words open on his knees. His eyes were hollow from hours of reading, yet he could not close it, could not escape the voice of the woman he had abandoned. Clara noticed him watching. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then she sat up slowly, brushing Sophie's hair back. "You stayed awake all night," she said. Alexander's throat tightened. I couldn't sleep. Because of us? He hesitated, then shook his head. Because of me. The girl studied him, as if weighing the sincerity of his words. Sophie yawned, sat up, and rubbed her eyes. She smiled sleepily at him. A small, fragile smile that reminded him too much of Mary. Are you going to send us away now? Sophie asked, her voice gentle, unassuming, almost casual. Alexander's chest seized. No. The answer came out before he could think. No, I won't. Clara's gaze sharpened. You could. You have the power to do whatever you want. He closed the notebook, pressing his palm against its frayed cover. I had the power to leave once. I won't make that mistake again. Clara didn't reply right away. She reached into the small satchel she always carried and pulled out 2 more flowers, each carefully wrapped in paper. One she placed in Sophie's lap. A bright sunflower, petals still strong despite the cold. The other she held up to Alexander, a red carnation, more vibrant than the one Sophie clutched. Mother said flowers carry meaning, Clara explained, her voice steady. Sunflower means hope. Carnation means remembrance. She looked at him, unblinking. Do you remember now? The question pierced deeper than accusation. It was not about memory. It was about responsibility. Alexander reached out, his hand trembling, and took the carnation. Yes, he whispered. His voice cracked. I remember. But Clara did not soften. Then prove it. The words hung between them, heavier than any contract, sharper than any deal he had struck. Alexander realized with a chill that the girl did not want his wealth, his protection, or his empire. She wanted him, his presence, his time, his love. And he had no practice at any of it. Money had always been his weapon, his shield. He could write a check big enough to silence almost anyone. But money meant nothing here. To these girls it was not currency. It was absence. He tried to steady himself. What would you like? He asked cautiously. Sophie's answer came first. Breakfast. The simplicity of it startled him. Breakfast. Not trust funds, not houses, not security guards, just food. The kind every child should wake up to without question. Clara's answer came slower. Consistency, she said at last. Her voice was steady, older than her years. Not just for today. Not just until you're bored. We don't need someone who disappears again. Her words struck him harder than any boardroom betrayal. Consistency. A concept he had never mastered. His empire thrived on risk, on volatility, on cutting ties when they no longer served him. But children were not investments. They could not be cut away. Alexander leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his eyes locked on hers. I don't know how to be what you need, but I will try. Clara's expression softened, just barely, but her guard remained. Trying isn't enough. Her bluntness did not offend him. It humbled him. This child, his child, demanded something no billionaire could purchase. Presence. The silence stretched until Sophie's stomach growled audibly. She giggled, covering her face. For the first time, Alexander laughed, a short, startled sound that felt foreign in his throat. Let's get you breakfast, he said. In the kitchen, the scale of the mansion revealed itself again. A cathedral of polished granite and untouched appliances. Alexander realized he had no idea how to cook. The house staff would usually arrive later in the day, but he did not want strangers here. Not now. He opened the fridge, uncertain. Eggs, bread, milk. He hadn't touched them in months. Clara stood beside him, arms crossed. You don't even know how, do you? He gave her a sheepish look. No. She sighed and rolled up her sleeves. I'll do it. The sight of her, small hands clumsily cracking eggs into a bowl, brow furrowed in concentration, broke something deeper in him. She should not have to know how to fend for her sister this way. And yet she did, because no one else had been there. Alexander stepped beside her. Show me, he said. She frowned. Why? Because I want to learn. From you. Her eyes widened slightly, as though caught off guard. Then, slowly, she handed him the whisk. Don't mess it up. The breakfast was imperfect. Scrambled eggs too salty, toast unevenly burned, but Sophie devoured it with delight, giggling at Alexander's clumsy efforts. Clara ate more cautiously, but there was a flicker in her eyes he had not seen before, the faint, reluctant spark of trust. When the plates were empty, Alexander looked at them both. You don't have to sell flowers anymore. Not in the cold. Not ever again. Clara shook her head firmly. We'll keep selling. For now. It's what Mama taught us, to work for what we have. If you want us to stop, then be here. Be our father, not just our rescuer. Alexander nodded slowly, humbled. He realized then that the flowers were more than survival. They were legacy. They were Mary's lesson carried in 2 small hands, 2 flowers, 2 daughters, and a man who had everything but nothing, until now. It was only a matter of time. For one night, Alexander had believed the walls of his mansion could keep the world at bay. He had fed the girls, watched them sleep beneath blankets too heavy for their small frames, and convinced himself that perhaps the storm could remain private. But in the morning, the gates were no longer silent. Cameras glinted like frost, voices buzzed beyond the iron bars, and the city that had worshipped him for decades had found a new story to devour. The tabloids had their headline by dawn. Billionaire seen with street children, secret family? The photograph was brutal in its clarity. Alexander kneeling in the snow, face caught between shock and grief, with Clara and Sophie standing before him like fragile shadows of accusation. It had been taken the night before, beneath that fractured street lamp, and now it was everywhere. Inside the mansion, Clara folded the newspaper with steady hands. They make it sound ugly, she murmured. Alexander, standing across from her, could not bring himself to look. He had lived long enough in the glare of the press to know their hunger. It's what they do, he said. Sophie, perched on the edge of the couch, tilted her head. Is it bad? That people know? Alexander exhaled slowly. For me, yes. He hesitated, then added, for you, it could be dangerous. Clara's eyes sharpened. Why? We didn't do anything wrong. Her words landed heavy. She was right. They had not done anything wrong, unless existing counted as wrong, unless survival was considered scandalous. But Alexander knew the boardrooms. He knew shareholders. He knew enemies who had been waiting years for a fracture in his image. And now, 2 children selling flowers in the snow had provided the perfect crack. The phone began to ring endlessly. His assistant, his legal team, the PR department, all demanding statements, all begging for denial. Say they're not yours, one voice insisted. Say it's charity. Say it's a misunderstanding. Alexander gripped the phone so tightly his knuckles whitened. The words balanced on his tongue, tempting, easy. A denial would silence the storm. A denial would restore his empire. A denial would erase the scandal. But across the room, Clara's eyes met his, dark, unwavering. the same eyes he had once carried in a boy's body selling apples on a corner street. And Sophie, too young to understand but old enough to feel, clutched her carnation close, as if bracing herself for abandonment. He set the phone down without a word. Clara studied him. "You were going to say we weren't yours." The accusation cut deeper than steel. "I was," he admitted. His voice shook. "But I didn't. Yet." Clara's arms crossed, her small frame radiating defiance. "You didn't yet." He wanted to argue, but he couldn't. The truth was raw and undeniable. He had thought it. He had considered it. And the thought itself was betrayal enough. He rubbed his temples. "You don't understand the weight of this. The world I live in, it destroys anyone who shows weakness." Clara's reply was cold and sharp. "We're not weakness. We're yours." The words silenced him. For years he had defined strength as profit, as dominance, as standing alone at the top of the tower he built. But here, in the voice of a child, was a definition he had never considered. Strength as presence, strength as responsibility. The day dragged on under the weight of headlines. Trucks with satellite dishes lined the street. Neighbors whispered. Even the staff in his house moved with unease, glancing at the girls as though they were dangerous secrets. At lunch, Sophie asked timidly, "Can we go outside, just to see the garden?" Alexander hesitated. He had always guarded his estate like a fortress, but what threat could flowers and grass pose? He nodded. The garden had been sculpted to impress investors, hedges trimmed into perfect geometry, fountains frozen mid-splash. But when Sophie ran through it, her laughter cracked the ice. She bent to pick a dandelion, her face glowing as if she had discovered treasure. Clara followed, slower, more watchful, her eyes still cutting back toward the mansion, toward him. Alexander stood at the window, watching them. The camera flashes beyond the gate seemed distant for a moment. What mattered was here. Two girls in the winter garden, chasing pieces of a childhood they had almost lost. Yet even as warmth flickered, the phone rang again. This time it was the chairman of his board. The voice was clipped, venomous. "Alexander, this cannot stand. You're risking everything. Deny them, or we will move without you." He stared out the window at Clara and Sophie. Sophie was holding up her dandelion triumphantly. Clara's expression softened just enough to let her guard slip. "Do what you must," Alexander said into the phone. His voice was calm, steady, a tone he hadn't used in years. "But I will not deny them." The silence on the other end was electric. Then the voice spat. "You're finished." Perhaps he was. But for the first time in decades, Alexander felt something other than emptiness in his chest. It was fear, yes, but also resolve. That evening, he joined Clara and Sophie in the garden. Sophie slipped her small hand into his without hesitation. Clara stood a step behind, uncertain, testing him with her silence. He looked down at them, at the dandelion and the carnation, at the living proof of Mary's love and his failure. And he realized that the scandal outside his gates was nothing compared to the reckoning inside them. For the Empire, this was ruin. For him, it was the beginning of truth. The envelope lay on Alexander Hale's desk like a weapon. It was nothing more than paper, thin, cream-colored, sealed in a plastic sleeve. But his hands trembled as if it might explode when he touched it. For a man who had stared down hostile takeovers, lawsuits, even governments, this was the first piece of paper that truly terrified him. The room was silent except for the faint ticking of a clock. Clara and Sophie sat together on the couch, their legs dangling, their eyes watchful. They didn't fully understand what was inside the envelope, but they understood enough. The man in front of them had chosen to seek proof of what their mother had already written in tears and ink. Alexander reached for it, then stopped. He wasn't ready. Why did I do this? He thought bitterly. He had wanted certainty, yes, wanted something indisputable. But the truth was, he had wanted escape. He had wanted the test to give him a reason to walk away, to declare the children someone else's burden. Now the envelope sat there, heavy with the judgment he could no longer delay. "Open it," Clara said quietly. He looked up. Her voice was calm, but her eyes burned. She had known all along. She didn't need a lab to confirm what she had lived in hunger, in abandonment, in survival. His fingers tore the seal. The words were clinical, unfeeling. Probability of paternity, 99.999%. Alexander's breath caught. He read it again, slower this time, as if his mind refused to believe the numbers. But they did not change. The truth was written in the language of science, irrevocable. Sophie tilted her head. What does it mean? His throat tightened. He forced the words out. It means, I am your father. The silence that followed was unbearable. Clara didn't flinch, didn't even blink. She simply folded her arms across her chest, her chin lifting. Sophie's eyes widened, her small hands tightening around the carnation she still carried. You knew already, Alexander said softly to Clara. She nodded. Mama told us. Something inside him broke. He leaned back in his chair, pressing his palm against his eyes. Why didn't I look for you sooner? He whispered. Clara's reply was a dagger. Because you didn't want to. The words sliced through every defense he had built. He lowered his hand and looked at her. This girl, his daughter, had inherited not only his eyes, but his ability to see through lies. Sophie slipped off the couch and padded toward him. She climbed onto his lap as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Her small weight stunned him more than the test result. She placed the flower into his hand. Does this mean we can stay? She asked. His voice cracked. Yes, Sophie. It means you can stay. Clara's gaze softened, but only slightly. Words aren't enough, she said. He nodded slowly. Then I will prove it with more than words. The knock on the door shattered the fragile silence. His assistant stepped in, pale with tension. Sir, the board has called an emergency meeting. The media won't let this go. They're saying you've hidden 2 children for over a decade. Alexander's jaw tightened. Tell them I'll face them tomorrow. The assistant hesitated. They're threatening to remove you as CEO. For years, those words would have filled him with fire, with calculation, with ruthless strategies to crush the opposition. Tonight, they felt small compared to the weight of a child's hand in his. Then let them try, he said coldly. When the assistant left, Clara whispered, You're really going to fight them for us? Alexander turned to her, his voice steady. No, I'm not fighting them for you. I'm fighting because of you, because the man I was before, he doesn't get to exist anymore. Clara studied him for a long time, her guard still half raised. But Sophie leaned against his chest, her small body warm, her trust uncalculated. And in that moment, Alexander realized that no empire, no boardroom, no scandal could outweigh the fragile heartbeat he felt against him. The test had confirmed what Mary's notebook had already told him, what his eyes had already known. These girls were his, not a scandal, not a burden, not a secret. His daughters. and the world would have to reckon with that. The boardroom had always been Alexander Hale's kingdom. For 30 years, it was where he reigned with unshakable authority, a place where his word bent markets, where his silence could crush careers, where his presence was enough to make men tremble. But not today. Today, as he entered the glass-walled chamber at the top of Hale Global's headquarters, the atmosphere was electric with hostility. Cameras swarmed outside the skyscraper. Journalists shouted questions from the sidewalk far below. The words, secret children, scandal, fraud were already burning through every news ticker. The men and women around the table didn't rise when he walked in. They didn't even mask their disdain. They had smelled blood, and for the first time, it wasn't his enemies in the market. It was Alexander himself. "Sit," the chairman barked. Alexander sat, not as a king, but as a man carrying 2 children's future on his back. The chairman slid a folder across the table. Inside were headlines, stock reports, and angry shareholder letters. His voice dripped with venom. "You've destroyed decades of trust. You're telling us the 2 girls in those photos are yours?" Alexander's jaw tightened. He could deny it. He could claim charity, twist the truth, stall for time. Every instinct of the empire builder in him screamed for strategy. But then he remembered Sophie on his lap, whispering, "Does this mean we can stay?" He remembered Clara's steady demand, "Prove it." "Yes," he said firmly. "They are mine." Gasps rippled around the table. The chairman slammed his fist down. "Then you have ruined us. Do you realize the damage? Investors are pulling out. The press is circling like vultures, and you—" "I will not deny my daughters," Alexander cut in, his voice like steel. The room froze. For the first time in his career, Alexander was not defending his company. He was defending 2 small lives. One director sneered. "You think anyone cares about your fatherly epiphany? We care about numbers, stocks, stability. If you can't keep your personal life from destroying this company, then you are finished." Alexander leaned forward. His voice dropped into the kind of quiet that once silenced entire markets. "Let me be clear. I built this empire from nothing. I bled for it. But if you think I will sacrifice my children to protect it, you've misunderstood me. Money can be rebuilt. Legacies can be rewritten. But blood cannot be bought." The words hung in the air, heavier than profit margins. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the chairman hissed, "You're a fool." "Maybe," Alexander said, "but I am a fool who will not abandon them again." The vote was swift, brutal, unanimous. Alexander Hale was stripped of his title, his authority, his empire. Security was called, though he walked out long before they could lay a hand on him. The flash of cameras blinded him as he exited the building. Reporters shouted questions. "How long have you hidden them? Did you abandon their mother? Are you unfit to lead?" Alexander did not answer. He did not need to. Because when the glass doors slid shut behind him, Clara and Sophie were waiting at the curb. Not with microphones, not with accusations, but with flowers in their hands, a sunflower and a carnation, trembling slightly in the winter wind. Sophie ran to him first, clutching his coat. "You came back," she whispered. "I told you I would," Alexander said, his voice thick. Clara walked slower, her gaze searching his face. "What happened?" "I lost," he said simply. Clara studied him, the silence stretching. Then she shook her head. "No. You chose." Her words broke him open. He crouched, pulling both girls into his arms as the cameras flashed wildly around them. Let the world see. Let them spin their stories. Call it scandal. Call it ruin. They did not know the truth. The truth was that for the first time in his life, Alexander Hale had stopped building empires and started becoming a father. And in that loss, he had won everything. They blurred the faces first. On the morning shows and in the late-night panels, the images of two small bodies standing beneath a broken street lamp became silhouettes with smudged eyes and pixelated cheeks. The anchors spoke in careful legalese. 2 minors, 2 dependents, 2 alleged wards. As if the shape of a child could be filed down to a case number without bleeding. By noon, the board's statement appeared on every financial feed. Hale Global distances itself from the personal matters of its former CEO. No comment on paternity. Requests that the press refrain from naming the minors. It sounded like protection. It felt like erasure. In the library, Alexander closed the laptop and stared at the fire until the flames blurred. Clara sat at the table with a pencil, rewrapping the sunflower in a square of brown paper, the movements neat and steady. Sophie lay on the rug, drawing daisies in a field that filled an entire page. She hummed without words. "They won't say our names," Clara said, not looking up. Alexander swallowed. "They will." Her pencil paused. "Who will make them?" He opened Mary's notebook instead of answering. On a page where the paper had softened with handling, Mary had written in slow, careful script, "Clara Merritt, because she carried light into rooms I could not enter. Sophie Merritt, because she smiled first and taught me what hope sounds like." He traced the letters with a fingertip until his hand steadied. "Mary Merritt," he said aloud, tasting the completed name for the first time. He had never asked her last name to sit beside his. He had never given her the dignity of saying it with reverence. He said it again. "Mary Merritt, Clara Merritt, Sophie Merritt." Sophie popped up. "That's us." Clara's mouth lifted, almost a smile, almost forgiveness, but then footsteps sounded in the hall, quick and crisp. The head of his security detail, a woman with hair drawn severe and a face that apologized for nothing, stepped in. "2 reporters at the gate," she said. "One of them tried to hand your daughter a check yesterday. We removed them. They'll try again." Clara's pencil snapped in 2. "They said they'd help tell our side," she said flatly. "But they wanted us to use new names. Easier names. Not ours." Sophie leaned into her sister. "They wanted to call me Sunny," she whispered, "because of the sunflower." Something cold moved through Alexander's chest. "No," he said, too quietly for anyone but the girls to hear. Then, louder. "No." He stood, the decision already formed. "Call the car," he told security. "We're going to City Hall." The clerk's office smelled like paper and tired coffee. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, turning everyone the same thin shade of gray. People waited on benches, clutching folders like life rafts. A calendar with a curling corner announced December, as if the month had decided to linger. A clerk with reading glasses slid a laminated number toward him. "Take a seat. You'll be called." The screen ticked forward. 41, 42, 43. When it reached 44, a voice called, "Case 14B, Paternity Acknowledgement." Alexander rose with the girls and stepped to the window. The clerk looked up, bored. "Forms?" He placed the state forms on the counter. They were filled out in his careful hand, a hand accustomed to signing mergers that outlived men. Today the letters seemed to glow. The clerk skimmed, then stopped. "You've hyphenated." "Yes," Alexander said. "If they choose to keep Merritt, they keep Merritt. If, one day, they want Hale, they can have it. They will not need my name to be mine. But no matter what they choose, their mother's name stays. Non-negotiable. The clerk's eyes flicked to Clara and Sophie. Slowly, something softened in his face. "All right," he said, and stamped the papers with a thud that felt like an oath. "We'll file them today." He pushed a signature pad forward. Alexander signed, the electronic pen scratching. The clerk reached for a rubber stamp again, then paused. "Do you want the official record to reflect preferred names? Some parents do." Alexander turned to the girls. "Do you?" Sophie nodded hard. "Sophie Merritt, and I want to learn to write it without making the P look like a 9. Clara lifted her chin. "Clara Merritt, for now." She glanced at Alexander, then away. "We'll decide the rest later." The clerk smiled. Quick and human. "We'll note it." When they stepped back into the winter light, the wind sliced through their coats, but the air felt cleaner. Names had been spoken. Ink had darkened paper. What the screens blurred, the state had written down with a stamp and a seal. "Lunch?" Alexander asked. Sophie voted loudly for soup. Clara said nothing, but she didn't pull her hand away when his brushed hers. That evening, the PR firm he had not yet fired sent a draft statement to his inbox. "For the privacy and protection of all parties, we will not be using names. We ask the press to respect this decision and refer to the minors only as the dependents." He typed his reply slowly, line by deliberate line. "We will protect their safety, not their erasure. If you need a name to write, write mine. If you need a face to film, film mine. But when you speak of the girls, speak correctly." He deleted dependents and wrote the names, Clara Merritt and Sophie Merritt. He hit send and closed the laptop. The first call came from a morning show with a host known for soft voices and soft knives. "Tell your redemption story," the producer cooed. "We'll keep the children anonymous if you sign our exclusivity." "No," Alexander said, and hung up. The second call oozed from a legal office that had once sharpened his own blades. "We represent interested parties who believe the minors' biological ties have been misrepresented," the attorney said, voice smooth with money. "We advise immediate non-disclosure and removal of public identifiers to prevent confusion." "Whose confusion?" Alexander asked. "The market's." He hung up again, then picked up the phone once more. This time he called the superintendent of a district close to the mansion, a place he could walk if the gates ever closed behind him again. "I want to enroll 2 students after the holidays," he said. "We'll work with you on safety, but I would like their names on the rolls." "Of course," the woman said, and there was warmth in her voice that had been missing from every conversation in days. "We'll be ready." He set the phone down and stared at the ceiling for a long time. The strange quiet that followed felt less like defeat and more like a new kind of order arriving. Later, under a sky bruised with early winter, he took the girls to the back garden. The ground crew had left a tray of paving stones near the path, fresh cement waiting for placement in spring. He looked at the trowel, then at the girls. "People forget ink," he said, rolling up his sleeves. "Paper disappears. Let's try something that lasts." They kneeled around the wet gray surface. Clara pressed the tip of a stick into the cement, careful and slow. C-L-A-R. A. Each letter neat, declarative, unafraid. She paused at the end, glanced at Alexander, and added the smallest slash of a hyphen with an empty space after it, as if leaving room for tomorrow. Sophie's turn was messier, joyous. She carved her name in loops too large for the stone, then drew a sunflower that tilted its painted face toward an imagined sun. Alexander hesitated. He had no right to place his name beside theirs, not yet. He picked up the stick and wrote a single word above both. Mary. He did not expect the sound that tore through his chest. It was not a sob. He had done that already. It was a breath like a vow exhaled. Sophie touched the letters with the careful awe of a child learning the shape of holiness. "Is Mama happy?" she asked. "I think so," Alexander said. The answer did not tremble. Clara rested the stick across the edge of the stone. "People will step here," she said. "Good," he replied. "Let them learn the names they were asked to forget." They sat until the cement began to hold. The cold bit their fingers. The sky paled and thinned, and somewhere beyond the hedges, a car idled and a camera clicked. The world still wanted a story. Let them take one. When they went inside, Alexander stopped at the desk. He pulled a thick vellum envelope from a drawer and slid Mary's notebook into it as gently as if laying a child to sleep. He sealed it and wrote on the front, in his own hand, "For Clara and Sophie Merritt. When you are ready." A knock sounded at the door frame. The security chief stood there, grave. "A blogger posted the school enrollment inquiry," she said. "They're misnaming the girls again. The dependents, the wards, and a rumor about changing surnames to avoid scandal." Alexander picked up his phone and opened the Notes app. He typed a statement that was not crafted but spoken line by line to a room of two. "You will not rename my daughters to suit your headlines. You may disdain my failures. I have earned that. But write their names correctly or not at all. Clara Merritt and Sophie Merritt. Their mother's name is Mary. Remember her too." He posted it without letting anyone soften the edges. Within minutes, responses flooded in. Cruelty, kindness, curiosity, the full churn of a public that feeds on both mercy and malice. He read none of it. He crossed the room and knelt by the couch where Sophie was arranging her drawn daisies into a paper meadow. "What are you making?" he asked. "A place where names don't blow away," she said solemnly, and tapped the corner where she had written SOPHIE in letters that sprawled like vines. Clara closed her sketchbook and slid it beneath the cushion. "What happens when they try again?" she asked. "To make us smaller, to pretend we're nobody." He looked from one face to the other, the light in Sophie's eyes, the iron in Clara's posture, and felt a steadiness he had not known even at the peak of his power. "Then we speak louder," he said. "Not with shouting, with living, with showing up where they said we wouldn't, and staying when they said we couldn't." He reached for their hands, one small, one steady. "And if the world forgets, I will remind it. Every day. With your names." They ate soup at the table, steam fogging the window panes. Afterward, he washed the bowls while Clara dried and Sophie stacked the spoons with the solemnity of a ritual. When the dishes were done, he sat between them on the couch and opened the notebook's envelope just enough to read one line aloud, the line he could not stop hearing. They will never know him, but perhaps one day he will see them. He closed the flap and set it aside. "I see you," he said. "Clara Merritt, Sophie Merritt." Sophie leaned against him until her breathing slowed and smoothed into sleep. Clara stayed awake longer, studying his face as if memorizing the contours of a promise. When she finally rested her head on his shoulder, it was not surrender. It was a decision. A name written once, then again and again, until the letters knew where they belonged. Outside, another panel show began to talk, mouths moving beneath a ticker that didn't know how to spell love. Inside, 3 names settled into a new grammar. It would not fix history. It would not silence the world. But it would build something the world could not purchase, smooth or blur. Tomorrow might bring courts and papers and more hands trying to push the girls into silence. Tomorrow could try. Tonight, he spoke the names into the dark, each one a stone set in wet earth. Clara, he whispered. Sophie. And then, with a tenderness he had failed to show the living and owed to the gone, Mary. The mansion was quieter than it had ever been, yet not empty. For years, its silence had been oppressive, echoing with Alexander Hale's loneliness. Now it was filled with the small, ordinary sounds of life. Clara's pencil scratching across paper at the kitchen table, Sophie's laughter echoing down the hall as she chased the dog the groundskeeper had brought for them, the murmur of voices calling each other's names. Alexander sat in his study, the notebook closed before him, a new object resting beside it. A small glass vase. Inside were two flowers, a sunflower and a carnation, their stems uneven, their petals trembling slightly as if uncertain they belonged in so polished a room. He touched the rim of the vase with reverence. For decades, his desk had carried contracts worth billions. Now it carried something fragile, something alive, something that reminded him daily that legacy was not built in boardrooms, but in the quiet resilience of children. A knock at the door. Sophie peeked in first, her cheeks flushed from running. "Are you busy?" "Never for you," he said. Clara entered behind her, holding a folded paper. She stood straighter than her years, her expression as guarded as ever, but her eyes had softened in recent days. She placed the paper on his desk. "What's this?" Alexander asked. "Homework," Clara said simply. "The school gave us writing assignments." He unfolded the sheet. The title read, "My Family." His chest tightened. He read the first line, written in Clara's steady hand. "My name is Clara Merritt. My sister is Sophie Merritt. We have a father now. His name is Alexander Hale." The words blurred as his eyes burned. He blinked hard, forcing himself to keep reading. He is not perfect. He makes mistakes. But he tries. And sometimes trying is the bravest thing a person can do. Alexander pressed the paper against his chest. When he looked up, Clara's face was flushed. "It's not finished," she muttered. "It doesn't need to be," he said hoarsely. "It's perfect." Sophie climbed into his lap, curling against him. "Do we get to stay here forever?" He wrapped an arm around her, his voice steady. "Yes. This is your home now. Always." The girl's eyes lit, and something unspoken passed between them. Relief. Joy. The fragile belief that promises could finally be trusted. The outside world did not quiet. Newspapers still called it a scandal. Talk shows dissected his downfall. Investors whispered of betrayal. But Alexander no longer read the headlines. When microphones pressed near the gates, he stepped forward not to deny, not to bargain, but to say only, "Their names are Clara and Sophie Merritt. They are my daughters. That is all that matters." And when critics accused him of weakness, when former allies mocked him for choosing children over empire, he replied with words that silenced even the most ruthless voices. "Empires crumble, stock prices fall, but blood is eternal, and I will not abandon mine again." The words went viral not as scandal, but as truth. One evening, weeks later, Alexander found Clara in the garden where the cement stones had set. She was tracing the letters with her fingertip. Clara, Sophie, Mary. "You left space," Alexander said softly. Clara glanced at him. "For later." He knelt beside her. "Do you think there might be a place for my name, too?" She hesitated. The silence stretched. Then slowly, She nodded. If you keep proving it. He smiled, humbled. I'll spend the rest of my life doing that. That night, after tucking Sophie into bed, Alexander lingered at the doorway. Clara was still awake, sitting cross-legged on her bed with Mary's notebook open in her lap. You can keep it, he said. Clara looked up, startled. But it's yours. He shook his head. It was never mine. It was hers. And now it's yours. A record of where you came from. A reminder of who she was. And a promise of where we're going. Clara's lips trembled. She closed the notebook carefully and whispered, Thank you. He crossed the room, kissed her forehead. Awkward, uncertain, but sincere. She closed her eyes, and for the first time, did not pull away. Later, in the quiet of his study, Alexander sat before the vase again. The sunflower tilted toward the window, the carnation leaning against it, fragile but unbroken. He placed a hand over his chest and whispered the three names that anchored him now. Clara, Sophie, Mary. And then, for the first time in decades, he whispered his own, not as a titan, not as a brand, but as part of something larger. Father. Tears blurred the flowers on his desk, but he did not wipe them away. They fell freely, not as shame, but as release. The empire was gone. The boardroom was lost. But in their place, something greater had taken root. 2 daughters, a legacy of love, a future he would never again turn away from. And on his desk, where power had once been signed into being, 2 trembling flowers stood as proof that even the coldest man could bloom again. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of this story. Perhaps you felt it too, that the most precious things in life are not money, not skyscrapers, but love, presence, and the simple act of holding each other's hands. If today's story touched your heart, please leave a comment and share your feelings with us. And don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next stories. Stories of resilience, of family, of the quiet belief that even in the darkest night, a small light still shines. Once again, thank you for listening. We truly cherish every moment you spend with this channel.